Ethan Vale had worked in the Royal Archive for 10 years, and during those 10 years he solved more problems than most people in the kingdom would ever know. Whenever a trade official needed records, Ethan found them. Whenever military officers needed reports, Ethan prepared them. Whenever engineers needed old documents to repair barriers or roads, Ethan knew exactly where to look. The problem was that nobody outside the archive actually understood how important that work was. That became painfully obvious during the kingdom's annual reward ceremony. The hall was packed with nobles, generals, merchants, and government officials. One after another, people stepped forward to receive rewards. Some received gold, others received promotions. A few even received land and titles. Then Ethan's name was called. After 10 years of service, he was handed a small wooden token. At first, Ethan thought there had been a mistake. Then he noticed people laughing. Some nobles were whispering to each other. Others were openly smiling. To them, the situation was funny. A man who spent his life working with records had received a reward that looked almost worthless. The person enjoying it most was Lord Victor Ashen. Victor had recently become Minister of Administration, and he already considered the archive a waste of resources. As far as he was concerned, the kingdom spent too much money storing old documents nobody cared about. When Ethan received the wooden token, Victor didn't stay quiet. He openly told everyone that people were giving the archive too much credit. According to him, kingdoms survived because of soldiers, merchants, and mages. Archive workers simply organized information that other people created. Several nobles immediately agreed. Others laughed. Nobody defended Ethan. That was the moment Ethan finally understood something. The problem wasn't the wooden token. The problem was that nobody in power understood the value of his work. So the next morning he submitted his resignation. The decision shocked a few people inside the archive, but it didn't shock Victor. In fact, Victor approved the resignation almost immediately. He believed the department would continue functioning normally. After all, if organizing records was such simple work, replacing Ethan should be easy. Unfortunately for him, the first problem appeared before lunch. A trade official arrived looking for transportation records connected to an important grain shipment. The shipment supplied several cities and the documents were needed immediately. Normally, Ethan would have found them within minutes. Instead, multiple clerks spent hours searching through shelves. The records were eventually found, but by then the shipment had already been delayed. The official left angry. Victor dismissed the incident and blamed poor communication. Then a second problem appeared. Military officers requested updated border reports from the northern region. The archive provided the wrong files. The officers returned them and requested the correct documents. The archive delivered another set. Those were outdated too. By the end of the day, the officers left without the information they needed. Victor still wasn't concerned. In his mind, employees simply needed time to adjust after Ethan's departure. The following morning proved otherwise. Merchants requested approval records for several trade agreements. Nobody could find them. Tax officials requested land ownership records. Those couldn't be located either. Engineers responsible for maintaining the capital's magical barrier requested maintenance logs. The archive searched for hours and still failed to deliver the correct files. As more requests arrived, the situation became increasingly chaotic. Clerks started searching every shelf repeatedly. Documents covered tables. Staff members argued over filing systems. People worked longer hours trying to solve the growing mess. The harder they worked, the worse things became. The reason was simple. Most people thought Ethan's job was storing records. It wasn't. Ethan had spent 10 years building a system that connected thousands of documents together. He knew which reports contained errors. He knew which records had updated versions. He knew which files were connected to trade routes, military operations, tax reports, and infrastructure projects. The system made sense to him because he built it. Without him, everyone else was trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. By the third day, the problem spread beyond the archive. A food convoy received outdated route information and ended up taking the wrong road. Deliveries were delayed, and merchants immediately started increasing prices. At nearly the same time, border commanders received incorrect monster activity reports. Troops were deployed to the wrong locations, forcing nearby villages to prepare emergency evacuations. Now senior officials started paying attention. One delayed report could be ignored. Dozens of delayed reports could not. Meetings were called, complaints were filed, departments started blaming each other. And every discussion eventually led to the same name. Ethan. The trade office said Ethan usually handled those records. The military said Ethan normally verified those reports. The engineering department said Ethan maintained those archives. The tax office said Ethan understood the filing system better than anyone else. Victor kept hearing the same answer everywhere he went. Ethan handled it. At first, he resisted the idea. He didn't want to admit that one person could be so important. Then another problem landed on his desk. The Royal Treasury discovered inconsistencies in several financial records. Normally, Ethan would trace the original documents and identify the mistake within hours. Nobody else could. The investigation stalled completely. Victor responded by assigning multiple senior clerks to divide Ethan's responsibilities. The solution failed immediately. Each clerk knew one section of the archive. One understood trade records. Another understood taxes. Another specialized in military reports. None of them understood everything. Ethan did. After several more days of failure, Victor finally accepted a truth he had been avoiding. The archive wasn't struggling because people were lazy. The archive was struggling because nobody could replace Ethan. The realization came too late. By then, complaints were arriving from every corner of the kingdom. Merchants were frustrated. Officials were frustrated. Military commanders were frustrated. Even nobles who had laughed during the reward ceremony were now demanding answers. Victor had gone from mocking Ethan to desperately needing him back. So he sent messengers across the kingdom with a simple order. Find Ethan Vale. Offer him more money. Offer him whatever he wants. Just bring him back. Several riders left the capital immediately. A few days later, one of them finally found Ethan resting in a small roadside town. The messenger quickly explained everything that had happened since his departure: missing records, delayed shipments, government complaints, growing chaos inside the archive. Then he presented Victor's offer. After listening patiently, Ethan asked only one question. Did Victor apologize? The messenger hesitated before answering. No. Ethan nodded. Then my answer is still no. The messenger tried again. He explained how many people were depending on him. He explained how serious the situation had become. Ethan listened politely, but never changed his answer. Eventually, the messenger returned to the capital alone. Victor was furious when he received the report, but anger didn't solve the problem. The archive remained in chaos. Trade delays continued. Military reports were still arriving late. Government departments were still fighting over missing records. And every day created new problems. Meanwhile, Ethan continued traveling away from the capital, completely unaware that his next destination would change his life forever. Because while the kingdom was desperately trying to recover from losing him, Ethan was about to discover an opportunity far greater than anything the palace had ever offered. The town was called Ashford. Ethan almost missed it completely. He had been traveling for 3 days when his horse refused to go any further. The animal was tired, the road was broken, and the nearest inn according to his map was another half-day away. So Ethan walked to the closest settlement he could find and hoped it had somewhere to sleep. What he found was barely a town. Maybe 40 houses, a broken well in the center, fields that hadn't been properly farmed in years, a few children playing in the dirt, old people sitting quietly outside their homes with expressions that had long since given up on expecting anything better. The only inn had 2 rooms and a roof that leaked when it rained. Ethan paid for a room and sat down at the inn's single table. The innkeeper, an older woman named Sira, brought him bread and soup without saying much. She looked like someone who had learned not to waste energy on conversations that wouldn't lead anywhere useful. But Ethan was curious by habit. He asked her how long the town had been like this. Sira paused. Then she sat down across from him, which surprised him a little. She said Ashford used to be different. 20 years ago it had markets. Traveling merchants stopped regularly. There were nearly 200 families living within a day's ride of the center. Then a flood came. Then a drought. Then the main road got rerouted further north and merchants stopped coming. People left one by one. The ones who stayed were mostly the ones too old to start over somewhere new. She said the town probably had 5 more years before the last family packed up and left. Ethan listened to all of this and didn't say anything right away. He just ate his soup slowly, looking at the table. Then he asked Sira if the town had any old records, maps, documents, anything left over from before the flood. She looked at him strangely. She said there might be some old papers in the storage room attached to the community hall. Nobody had looked at them in years. She wasn't sure anyone even remembered they existed. Ethan asked if he could look. She shrugged and handed him the key. The storage room was exactly what he expected. Dust, boxes, broken furniture pushed against the walls, rolled up papers that had been sitting in wooden tubes for so long the tubes had warped from moisture. Ethan spent the rest of the evening going through everything. Most people would have given up after an hour. Ethan worked until the candle burned down to almost nothing. What he found changed everything. Buried under a collection of tax notices and property disputes from 30 years ago was a map. Not a modern one, an old one, drawn by hand, covering the entire region around Ashford, including areas that didn't appear on any standard kingdom map. Ethan had seen thousands of documents in the Royal Archive. He knew immediately that this map was accurate. The style of measurement, the way elevation was marked, the symbols used for water, all of it matched survey techniques from about 80 years ago, which meant the map was made before the flood rerouted the river. He spread it out carefully on the floor. The original river path was clearly marked. And when he traced it, he noticed something that made him stop completely. The flood hadn't just damaged Ashford, it had buried something. According to the old map, there was a spring system underneath the eastern hill just outside of town, a natural underground water source that fed the original river. The flood had covered the entrance with sediment, which meant the water was still there. The next morning, Ethan found Sira before she started cooking breakfast. He asked her who in town was best at digging. She stared at him for a long moment. Then she called him strange and went to get a man named Bren. Bren was somewhere around 50, built like someone who had spent every year of his life doing physical work, and deeply suspicious of strangers who showed up asking odd questions. He stood in the inn doorway with his arms crossed and listened to Ethan explain what he had found on the map. When Ethan finished, Bren said nothing for several seconds. Then he said, "If there was water under that hill, someone would have found it by now." Ethan replied, "Not if nobody knew where to look." Bren didn't look convinced, but he also didn't have anything better to do. So he agreed to spend one morning digging in the location, Ethan indicated on the old map. They found water before midday. Not a small trickle, a proper underground stream, cold and clean, pushing up through the opened ground with enough pressure to confirm it was connected to something much larger below. Bren stared at it for a full minute without speaking. Then he turned to Ethan and said, "Who are you exactly?" That was the moment things in Ashford started to change. Word spread quickly in a town that small. By afternoon, most of the remaining residents had walked out to the eastern hill to see the water themselves. They stood around the opening. Bren had dug and looked at it with expressions Ethan hadn't seen on their faces the evening before. Over the following days, Ethan kept going through the old documents. The water source was only the beginning. The original map also showed the location of the old North Trade Road, not the rerouted one that bypassed Ashford, but the original path that had been the reason merchants stopped here in the first place. The rerouted road had been built because engineers assumed the original path was too damaged to repair after the flood. But Ethan found maintenance records from 50 years ago showing the original road had been mostly intact. The decision to reroute had been based on incomplete information. The original path was actually shorter than the new road by nearly a third. If merchants knew that, they would come back. Then he found something else. A survey report, old enough that the ink had faded to brown, documenting mineral deposits in the hills 2 miles east of Ashford. The report had been filed with the kingdom's geological office decades ago. Nobody had followed up on it because the town's population had already started declining by then, and the project was abandoned before it started. The deposits were still there. Nobody had claimed them. Ethan sat back in the dusty storage room and looked at the ceiling. Ashford wasn't a dying town. Ashford was a town sitting on top of opportunities that nobody had ever properly mapped. He spent that evening writing out a plan, not for himself exactly, more because he couldn't look at a problem this clear and walk away from it. By the time he was done, it was past midnight. The plan covered 5 things. Restore the water supply properly, not just the single opening but channel it into the town center where it could be used properly. Document the original trade road and send the measurements to merchants through legitimate channels. File a formal claim on the mineral deposits before someone else stumbled across the old survey. Use the mine income to fund basic repairs to the town's buildings and infrastructure. And build a proper archive. Not for nostalgia, because Ethan had just spent 3 days learning exactly what happens when a place loses its records. It loses itself. He went to Sierra the next morning and showed her the plan. She read it slowly, then she read it again. Then she said, "This would take years." Ethan said, "Most things worth doing do." Sierra was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at him with the kind of expression that comes from spending a long time being disappointed and suddenly being offered a reason not to be. She said she would talk to the other residents. That afternoon, every person still living in Ashford sat together in the community hall for the first time in years. Ethan stood at the front and explained what he had found. Nobody interrupted him. When he finished, a woman near the back asked, "Why are you doing this? You're not from here." Ethan thought about that for a second. Then he said, "I spent 10 years organizing information for people who didn't understand why information mattered. Now I found a place where the right information could actually change something. I'd like to find out if I'm right." The woman nodded slowly. So did the people around her. They voted to start the following Monday. The work was harder than any of them expected. Channeling the water properly took 3 weeks and required skills nobody in Ashford had. Ethan wrote to craftsmen in a nearby town and offered work. 2 came. They weren't cheap, but the mineral claim Ethan had filed on the eastern hills had already attracted a small advance payment from a mining contractor who had been looking for exactly that type of deposit. The first money went straight into paying the craftsmen. By the time the water channel was complete, 4 new families had heard about what was happening and arrived to see it for themselves. 2 of them stayed. The road documentation took longer. Ethan personally walked the entire original path with Bren, measuring distances and recording the condition of the surface. The report he produced was detailed enough that a merchant guild 3 towns away agreed to send a small test convoy along the route. The convoy arrived in Ashford 7 hours faster than the standard route would have taken. Word of that spread quickly. Back in the capital, Victor Ashen was dealing with problems that had not stopped multiplying. He had tried everything he could think of to stabilize the archive without Ethan. He brought in outside experts. They spent a week reviewing the system and told Victor it would take years to rebuild properly. He reassigned more senior clerks. They made the situation worse by implementing 3 different filing systems simultaneously, none of which were compatible with each other. He requested emergency funds from the Treasury to hire additional staff. The Treasury told him to fix the financial records inconsistency first. That still hadn't been solved. Every path Victor took led back to the same wall. The information was gone, not physically gone. The documents were still there. But the understanding of how they connected to each other, the invisible system Ethan had spent a decade building, that was gone, and nobody knew how to rebuild it. Meanwhile, Myra Cross, who had been enjoying her success after the reward ceremony, was discovering that the credit she had taken for Ethan's work was becoming a problem. Officials who had previously praised her were now asking her to solve problems she had no idea how to approach. She tried her usual method. She looked confident. She spoke in general terms. She bought herself time with vague reassurances. But the questions were becoming too specific. One senior official sat across from her in a meeting and asked her to explain exactly how the old cross-reference trade records worked and why the current system wasn't producing the same results. Myra had no answer. She excused herself, saying she would look into it. She never came back to that meeting. Ethan didn't know any of this was happening. He was too busy watching Ashford grow. By the 3rd month, the town had doubled in size. A small market had appeared near the water channel. Merchants making the run on the old road started stopping overnight instead of pushing through. A blacksmith arrived, then a doctor, then a family that wanted to open a bakery. Bren, who had been suspicious of Ethan on the first day, became something like a deputy. He managed the physical work. Ethan handled the information. It was a comfortable arrangement. One evening, sitting outside the inn after a long day, Bren said something that stuck with Ethan for a long time. He said, "You know what the difference is between this town now and 3 months ago? It's not the water or the road. It's that someone finally paid attention to it." Ethan thought about that. He thought about 10 years of work in the archive, thousands of documents, every trade route and military report and engineering plan carefully organized and cross-referenced. All of it ignored by the people who should have valued it most. He thought about the wooden token. Then he looked at the town around him. Lights in windows that had been dark when he arrived. Children running between houses. The sound of hammering from the new building going up on the eastern side of the market. He decided he was fine. But something was coming that Ethan hadn't accounted for. Because 400 miles away, in the capital, a man with bruised pride and very dangerous connections had just received a report. A report about a small, growing town called Ashford. And the name of the man who had built it from nothing. Victor Ashen read that report twice. Then he put it down on his desk and stared at the wall for a very long time. When his assistant asked if he needed anything, Victor told him to close the door. Whatever he was planning, he wanted to think about it alone. So Ashford is growing. Water found, road restored, merchants arriving, mine producing income. A dead town is breathing again, and word reached Victor Ashen. Victor had publicly humiliated Ethan, approved his resignation with a smile, told a room full of nobles that anyone could organize papers. That same man was now being praised by merchant guilds. Victor called his assistant and said one thing: "Find me a weakness in Ashford's legal documents." First attack. A tax inspector arrived claiming the mineral survey was too old to be legally valid. Mining had to stop. Ethan asked one question: which regulation? Read it that night. Found the exception clause nobody had checked. Historical surveys under kingdom authority before a certain date remained valid if no dispute was ever filed. Nobody had ever disputed Ashford's survey. He sent a formal response the next morning with the exact clause and the original stamped document. 3 days later, the inspection was dropped without explanation. Bren looked at him and said, "That wasn't a mistake, was it?" Ethan just went back to work. Second attack was harder. Rumors spread through merchant circles. 2 guilds sent letters citing concerns about Ashford's stability. A road official announced the restored route needed formal kingdom approval before merchants could use it legally. 2 convoys changed their route. People got nervous. Sira came to Ethan and said, "Someone is trying to undo everything." He said, "Someone who has more to lose from our success than he gains from our failure." She said quietly, "Victor Ashen." He didn't deny it. Most people would have panicked, Ethan thought. Victor's strategy was simple: make Ashford look legally uncertain, scare merchants away, slow the growth, make Ethan look like someone whose success was just luck. So Ethan did what he always did. He removed the uncertainty completely. Filed a formal application for official road designation with every required document prepared, verified, and stamped. Before Victor's contact at the road authority even realized an application had been submitted. A properly filed complete application is nearly impossible to quietly bury. Victor's man could delay it, not kill it. Then he handled the merchant problem differently. Found out one guild official named Callan had started the chain of concern after receiving a private letter from the capital. Ethan didn't write back defending himself. He just invited Callan to visit. Callan arrived expecting problems. Found a working water system, a growing market, a mine producing income, and a road saving 7 hours compared to his current route. At dinner, Callan said, "Someone told me this was built on shaky ground. I'm not seeing that." Ethan said, "Someone wanted you to decide before you came and saw for yourself. The real question is whether you trust what you've seen today more than a letter from someone who has never visited this town." Callan left the next morning and sent a recommendation to his guild. 2 more guilds followed within the month. Every attack had failed. Victor sat reading the reports with the controlled expression of a man who is furious, but trained not to show it. But something else was bothering him now. While searching through the archive chaos himself, something he had never done before, he had found his own records from his first year as minister. Transactions with no proper destination, payments quietly redirected, documents moved in ways that only made sense if someone was hiding where the money went. He had always assumed those records were buried too deep. But Ethan built that system. Ethan knew every corner of it. Victor stood at his window and understood something clearly. Small attacks were not going to work. The longer Ethan grew stronger and more connected, the more dangerous he became. Victor had one move left, a bigger one, the kind that once started cannot be taken back. He turned from the window and started planning.